Thoughts on the readings for February 14th, Exodus 24:25, Psalm 78, Mark 10. Exodus 24 deals with the confirmation of the covenant. The commencement tells us that Moses, Aaron, Nadab and Abihu, two of Aaron's sons, together with 70 of the elders of Israel came towards God on the outskirts of Mount Sinai. Moses alone is invited to draw nearer. Moses rehearsed the Lord's words to the people of Israel. The people's response was a promise to obey God's commands. Moses arose early in the morning and constructed an altar of 12 unhewn stones and offered upon it burnt offerings and peace offerings. The blood was taken and used to sprinkle both the altar and the people. This was the method of confirming covenants. The altar spoke of God and the other party involved in the covenant, God's own people. After reading the book of the covenant to the people, their response was again to promise obedience. It was after that reading that the people of Israel were sprinkled with the blood that remained after the altars being redeemed by blood, Hebrews 9 verse 22. Moses, Aaron, Nadab, Abihu and 70 of Israel's elders were now invited into the mountain to participate in a fellowship meal with the God of Israel. The glorious scene gives us a cameo of the kingdom. Then Moses was invited to go further into the mount to receive the 2 tables of stone containing the 10 commandments. Joshua accompanied Moses part of the way on that journey. The cloud covered the mountain, and Yahweh's glory was evident. Moses ascended the mountain and was in the presence of the Lord's angel for 40 days. Chapter 25 reveals the instructions for Israel regarding the construction of a sanctuary for God to dwell among his people. Verse 8. The free will contributions for the materials of the tabernacle are described in verses 1 to 9. Note the repeated emphasis of the fact that the tabernacle was typical. Verses 9 and 40. The reality of the matter was that it was the pattern of which Christ was the reality, i.e., the substance, as the writer to the Hebrews made clear in chapter 9 verses 23 to 28. Verses 10 to 30 describe the construction of the Ark of the Covenant, the only item of furniture that was found in the most holy place representing our Lord Jesus Christ, in whom we find redemption. It was a box constructed from acacia wood and overlaid with gold, the former material speaking of his weakness and humanity, whilst the gold spoke of his precious faith, which was the basis for our salvation. The lid of the box was made from one single solid piece of gold and was beaten into the shape of 4 living creatures, or cherubic figurines: lion, eagle, ox and man, speaking of the unity between our Lord and his faithful saints. The glory of Yahweh dwelt upon the box's lid between the cherubim. That glory was called the Shekinah glory, from the word shaken, which means dwelling. The faithful saints beheld the glory of God, which was evidenced in God's Son, John 1 verses 14 to 18, and the blood-sprinkled mercy seat representing the offering of our Lord Jesus Christ, in whom we find sanctification. Verses 31 to 40 describe another vital piece of furniture speaking of an important part of our worship, the 7-branched golden lampstand. The number 7 speaking of perfection and of the covenant. The gold of tried faith, 1 Peter 1 verse 7. It was also fashioned from gold and was extremely heavy, weighing approximately 35 kilograms. It spoke of faithful labor in the word to produce the pure olive oil that would burn to give light in what would otherwise have been a completely dark place, the holy place inside the tabernacle. Psalm 78 is yet another from the pen of Asaph. He recounts the providence of the Almighty for his people Israel from their time in Egyptian bondage up to the care given to his people in the provision of the great shepherd King David, and beyond. It is a teaching maskell designed to provoke Israel's remembrance of the mighty deeds done for them by their sovereign. Its beginning speaks of employing the parabolic method that would be used by Messiah. See Matthew 13 verses 10-17. Yet despite this method, which both revealed and concealed truths, it was of vital importance that the saving message be understood. Verses 5 to 8 said that it was to be told from generations in order to try to avoid repeating the errors of the past. The time of writing is after the division of the kingdom, in Rehoboam's days, the grandson of David. It spoke in verse 9 of the aggressive nature of Ephraim, who assumed tribal dominance over 10 of the 12 tribes. From verses 10 to 14 it launches into its lessons about Israel's failure to appreciate what was done for them in bringing them out of Egypt and through the Red Sea. Verses 15 to 20 speak of the Lord's miraculous provision of water and manna in the desert. Yet in spite of this they grumbled and tempted their gracious God. Verses 20 to 31 tell how in addition to providing them sustenance their sovereign slew the foremost of the rebels. Verses 32 to 35 said that the Almighty knew how this would be the way frail and perishing ungrateful people would behave. So he disciplined them till they sought him once more. Verses 36 to 41 tells that once the chastening hand of God was lifted they reverted to their evil and thankless ways. In verses 42 to 51 the writer records the plagues on Egypt and said, "How could God's people possibly forget what Yahweh had done for his children?" The 52nd to 54th verses reminded the hearers of the fatherly compassion and care with which they had been brought to Sinai. Verses 55 to 58 reminded Israel of the help that they received in taking the land. Did they respond with gratitude? No. Verse 59, and so the Almighty allowed the plundering of his sanctuary at Shiloh by the Philistines. He next told of their suffering under the yoke of bondage brought by the Philistines. Then Yahweh arose and took vengeance against the adversaries of his people. Verses 67 to 68 tell of the great division of the kingdom. But the psalm concludes on a triumphant note that Solomon built a house for praise and worship. And before that the great shepherd of Israel gave to his people a mighty shepherd to lead them and to feed them in the paths of righteousness. Psalm 23 verses 1 to 6. In the record of Mark 10 Jesus tells us that the Mosaic Law sought to regulate putting away. The practice of divorce had become rife in our Lord's time. Jesus indicates that putting away was foreign to the Father's purpose in marriage described at the end of Genesis 2. The Almighty's purpose in marriage is elaborated in Malachi 2 verses 11 to 16. The record says that children were invited to come to Jesus for blessing in order to show that humility is essential for entry to the kingdom. The chapter says that a rich young ruler, who was deeply loved for his sincerity by Jesus, found his love of his possessions an obstacle too great to overcome. The amazed apostles were promised a place in the kingdom for faithfulness. For the third time Jesus foretells of his suffering, death, and rising. We are told that James and John came secretly to Jesus seeking the positions of honor in his glory to sit at our Lord's right and left hand in his kingdom. Those two apostles are told that they would suffer for his sake and that the Father alone could give such honors. The Lord's ministry, Jesus says, is service. This must also be true for all of Christ's followers. The chapter concludes by telling us that blind Bartimaeus was cured and follows Jesus. Penned by Warwick Rosser and his team, produced by KristaDelphinVideo.org.